welcome to another hour of unscripted .NET entertainment. Unscripted, however, does not mean unprepared. Uh, as cardiologists of the .NET community, we strive to prescribe heart-healthy choices in .NET. I am your host and cardiologist, Scott Addy, with co-hosts and cardiologists Myra Wenzel and Cecil Phillip. I'd like to welcome our very special guest today, Billy Mumby. Billy, would you mind just quickly introducing yourself to the viewers?
Hi, yeah, my name's Billy. I'm a senior developer at Next, a company in the UK who do retail. So I'm just here to talk about some work I've been doing on an open source Cosmos repository.
Very cool. Thanks again for joining us today, Billy. I know our viewers are super excited to have you here. Quick announcement before we jump into our usual format with the show. We have an exciting announcement today. We are refactoring the .NET Doc show as it exists, and we will be taking over on .NET Live. For on .NET Live viewers, you may recognize our dear friend Cecil, who drove that for a very long time. Uh, he's here for this announcement, thankfully. Uh, as we all know, the dry principle is important in software development. The same is true for live streams. So we'll be taking a few weeks off of the show, and we will be working on that show transition. More to come in the future. With that, why don't we roll into the checkup segment, and I can talk about what we have for you today. All right. So, since the focus for today's show is Azure Cosmos DB, we have a tutorial from docs.microsoft.com that will tell you all about how to perform CRUD operations in Cosmos DB using what we call the SQL API. Now, if you're not familiar with Cosmos DB, let me take a step back. This is a fully managed NoSQL database offering in Azure. It offers a total of 5 distinct APIs for querying. We have our core SQL API, which this doc is focused on. In addition to that, though, we have APIs for MongoDB, Cassandra, Gremlin, and the Table API. Again, the focus on this segment is that core SQL API that is native to Cosmos DB. To perform a query operation using the SQL API, you would use the structured query language SQL syntax that we've all used probably for years and are very familiar with. It's this API that will allow you to leverage that full feature set that is available in Cosmos DB. Any new features that are deployed are instantly made available through this API. Now, if we look at the tutorial, really this again is all about performing CRUD operations once you've provisioned your Cosmos resource and account. As such, the prereqs here, there's really just two for this tutorial. Obviously, you're going to need an Azure subscription, which is where the Cosmos resource would live. In addition to that, because this is focused on .NET devs, you would want to have the Visual Studio installed with the Azure development workload. With those two prereqs behind you, you can then jump into creating your Azure Cosmos DB account. Nice walkthrough of that here. But really, the more important part that I wanted to point out in this tutorial is, how would you actually programmatically query Cosmos using an SDK or a client library? This section here talks about that. You would install this Microsoft.Azure.Cosmos package, which I assume Billy is very familiar with, and we'll talk more about that later. Um, in current state, the latest stable release of this client library is v3. I will say the Cosmos DB team is actively working on that next major release, which is version 4. You would expect this tutorial to update once that next major release becomes available. If you then look at what else is in this doc, the last section I'll point out here is just simply how would you query that resource using a SQL query. Again, the syntax that you see here should feel very, very familiar. We're just querying on a customer's last name. If this doc is of interest to you, do check out the bottom of the screen and you'll notice the vanity URL is scrolling for it there. with that, why don't we jump into the hallway track and have a conversation with our guest, Billy? All
Hello.
right. Welcome to the hallway track where we attempt to recreate what you would have seen at a conference pre-pandemic. That really the vibrant, energetic hallway track conversation that you would have had with attendees. So we've got Billy here today to talk about Azure DB, Cosmos as it relates to .NET. Billy, why don't you just briefly explain what we plan to cover today?
Yeah, so I've been working a lot recently on an open source library that David made. It wraps the SDK that was shown in the demo, and it just provides a set of like helper methods effectively over the top and adds some things on top for configurability, and also allow us to interact with some of the more complex features of Cosmos DB in a nice clean API.
Cool. So for context, so when you say David, that's our co-host David Pine
Yes.
that's being talked about here, just so everyone knows. So my understanding is this is a open source project that I believe David started. Billy is like the number one contributor, helping David carry this forward and really maintain the project. Um, so I guess a good place to start here is why the need for this open source wrapper on top of the Cosmos client library? What problems does it aim to solve?
So I think what we'd found a lot is a lot of people sort of tend to go for a generic repository pattern on top of the SDK, and there's a lot involved in terms of setting up the containers and being consistent with that and providing all the settings across. And this library just sort of provides a nice, easy abstraction layer on top of that and allows you to interact with some of the more advanced features without necessarily having to get like right down in the mud with it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does. So we're again focused on the repository pattern. So let me get this straight. So if I'm not using the repository pattern, this library probably is not for me. Is that an accurate statement?
Yeah, I would say so. It's quite built. Well, the sole class in this is the iRepository. So
Okay, cool. Is there any kind of code that you wanted to share with us today, and we can kind of explain things through code and speak the audience's language?
yeah, I mean, I've put together a demo, so hopefully that can cover off quite a lot of what the library offers. So I'll share my screen.
Cool. Let's dive into that. And for our viewers, keep the questions coming in the chat window. We'll try to get to as many as we can.
And I imagine we have a repo or something that they can also go explore.
Yeah, I can share that afterwards. I've got a link for that. So I'm going to open source the code
Awesome.
straight after this. So cool.
Awesome.
Right. I'll just give a quick intro just to the demo that I've put together, and then we can move on and look at some of the code. So just put a little diagram together here. So we've just got a Blazor server app that talks to an API, which is using the Cosmos repository pattern. That talks to Cosmos, and then behind that, there's the set of containers which store the data. So container is a logical grouping of items, and that's how Cosmos DB stores its data. So I'll give a quick little walk through the app, and then I'll hopefully dig into some of the queries and how you use the library and set it up. So I went for a book rental store for this demo. So there's a basic sort of overview screen which has a list of categories for a book. You can click on a category, you can see the books listed, you can click on a book, and you can see that book. It's only a slight bit of information on here just for the demo. You can also take a rental out on that book. So if I was to put me in here, you can rent that book. I have to excuse my internet connection. And then you can view the rentals for a given customer. So if I was to pop a username in here, bring back my rental that I've just made there, and you could return that book. And then you could also query on the rentals for a book given its ISBN. So if I was to pull back up one of these books, let's go into the tech category, you could click on here, and that'll bring back the book rentals. So I suppose it's probably worth now going in and looking at the code and seeing how you'd set this up using the Cosmos SDK. So I've got the code here, and we'll focus mainly on the API project. There is the Blazor web app, but I suppose that's sort of out of scope of this demo. So the first
Billy, if you don't mind, could you bump up that font size just a little bit?
Yeah, sure, I can zoom in a bit.
Points?
Is that better?
Yeah, that's better. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. I might have to remind me. I think it's set on a default. So we've got here the minimal API setup. So currently I've written an extension method which adds the infrastructure layer in, so that will concern all of the Cosmos stuff. So if I jump into there, this is where you sort of get involved with the repository. It's the first sort of setup stage that you'll go through. So you've got a nice extension method on top of the iServices collection. That allows you to add the Cosmos repository, and then you get access to a set of options. So the first option on here is the container per item type. Now, for a lot of simple scenarios, you could just set this to false, and that would tell the library that you want to store every single item, which we'll come on to shortly, in the same container. That's good for simple scenarios, but in other scenarios where you'd like a more complex partitioning strategy on how you'd partition your data across those containers, it's best to set this to true. So the next bit is the database ID. So that's the name of the database that you would like it to be called. So in this case, I've just got the machine name in, and then the database ID, which in this case is brentalsdb. There is an option on here as well to set the connection string. I've currently got this set through .NET user secrets, but you can set that here as well and pull it out of config as you would like. And then the next bit, I suppose, is looking at how you'd configure item to be stored. So there's some configuration down here, but I'll just go over what a basic item is for a start. So we've got a book here. So that's what you'll have seen on one of the other screens. So the first thing to do is derive from one of the item types that the library provides. So in this case, I've used a full item. There is a couple of extra ones that you can use. So there's a base item. That is the most simplest version. The full item opts into quite a few other features, which I'll maybe come on to later. But the general idea of this is that it has an ID and a partition key method that you can override, and that will allow you to set what property you'd like to use on that item to partition your data. So in this scenario, we've got a book with a title, a list of authors, a category, and when it was published. So if I scroll down to the bottom, sort of exclude this constructor for now, we've got a partition key field here. This is something I chose to add in myself. It tends to be a common practice that I follow, that I'll have a property called partition key, and that's where I'll store my partition key value. So you can see in this constructor here, we pass in the books category, and that's set as the partition key in this sense. So all books in this example are partitioned by the category that they're in. Down here, we've got this override. So that is telling the SDK, as in the wrapper on top of the Cosmos SDK, what value you'd like to use as the partition key. So in this case, in all of my examples, it will always be this partition key property. So the next bit is, how do you configure the repository to know about this item? So for a starter, if I go back to the extension methods we were just looking at before, you get access to a container builder on the options type. Here you can configure an item to be stored in a container and declare some properties on that container. So in this case, we've got the book that we were just looking at. So we say it's got a with container, and then you pass the container ID. So in this case, it's just called books. Then you give it the partition key, and in this case, I'm just using a constant here. As we said before, all items will be partitioned by the same value. So in this case, it's /partition key. If you've gone for serverless throughput, just with the demo for cost purposes, that works out quite considerably cheaper. So we've got quite a few containers here. And then there's the with change feed monitoring, which we'll come on to a little bit later. But I think one thing to note here is that we've got the book and the book category. They're both sharing the same container. So if we jump over to Cosmos and we look in the portal, if we look in the books container, we've got a couple of different types of items in here. So first of all, we've got a book category. So in this case, I've chosen to partition the book categories by the book category field. So essentially all book categories are stored in the same partition. That means when we look at this screen on here, we can easily pull back all the categories in a partition via a single partition query, which is often key in Cosmos for anyone who's worked in it before. So the next part is we've got a book in here as well. So a book has got a completely different data structure, which is obviously the idea of NoSQL. And that's got the partition key value here set to tech. So this is in the tech category of books. And one thing the library adds is this type field. So here we can see type is book. And if we look at book category, you can see the type is book category. So that's how the library knows which items it's looking at when it makes a query, for example. So I suppose that's the general gist of the setup so far. When you call this add Cosmos repository, you get access to an interface, and it's a generic interface. I'll show an example of that here. So if we look at let's look at the starting query. This one's nice and simple. So we've got the fetch book categories. So by calling add Cosmos repository, you get this iRepository interface, which is available. And all you say is iRepository of the type that you would like to query. So in this case, we've got the book category and the book repository. And then we get access to a set of methods on there that allow you to run some queries. So if we start off with some of the most basic examples, look at the book repository, you can create a book, you can delete a book, you can get a single book or multiple books. There's also an option to update a book, but I suppose we'll focus on the query side for now, as this handler is the one that populates the screen that we was looking at earlier. So that is this category screen. Takes a little while to load, and I'll explain why in a moment. So this is the query handler that populates this screen. Get the right screen to go back to. So here, what we're doing is we're using the specification pattern. I don't know if anyone's heard of that before.
Yeah, I've heard about it before. Oh, and just really quickly, could you bump up the font again?
Yeah, sorry. Thanks.
We do have a question, Billy. Maybe we should
Yeah.
address this before we go much further. And I'll put the question up on the screen. The question is really which of the 5 Cosmos APIs is being used in this sample app that you have here. In the checkup doc, we were talking about that core SQL API, but I'm curious which API is being used here.
Yeah, this is exactly the same. So it's built on top of the core SQL API. It's a simple sort of wrapper on top of the demo, the application you were showing in the doc site. So
Okay.
yeah, this is using the SQL API as well.
So my question then, this nice segue into this, can this wrapper library be used with those other APIs?
Currently, I don't think so, no. I'm not
Okay.
sure that's something we've catered for yet. But it could be something we could potentially look at, I suppose.
Yep. So another question is, so maybe we should take a step back and look at the project file here so folks know which NuGet package is being used to enable this repository behavior.
Yeah, sure. So if we look at pull up the raw project file in this one. So it's just one package, and all you have to install here is for the basic implementation of the iRepository, you just saw iEvangelist Azure Cosmos repository, and we're currently at version 2.12.1. There
Okay.
is this package, which I'll come on to in a little bit later, but that's
And
sort of
then-
an extension.
Is it a true statement that this Cosmos repository package takes a dependency on the Microsoft Azure Cosmos library?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, cool. So, for folks who are asking in the chat, how do you contribute to this project? You could look up that NuGet package, and that'll take you out to the GitHub repository where Billy has been doing all this fantastic work with David.
Yeah, I'll share a link for that as well at the end, if that's all right.
Yep.
Yeah,
fine.
no, I mean, the funny story, when I initially sort of seen this the first time, I thought, come up with an idea, I thought this would be great. I raised the pull request, made a breaking change without even considering or thinking. And David quickly rebuffed that and sort of said, look, we need to think about this a bit more. It's probably best to start with an issue. So I suppose that's one piece of advice I'd always give. Raise an issue first, you can get some discussion before sort of going straight in at the code and just raising a pull request. That was certainly one thing I found.
Sure.
Yeah.
So is this a library that you're using in your day job to solve a particular problem?
Yeah, we use this as our sort of data access layer for Cosmos over quite a few of the services that we implement in my team. And I know a couple of other teams in the company are also looking at using it as well.
So is that what prompted you to start contributing to the project? Like you start using in your real projects and then like on your work projects and started like, oh, I see some need here that I need to address.
Yeah, that's where a lot of the sort of ideas have come from. It's sort of been as we've been using it, oh, this would be quite nice, this would be quite good. And then that's sort of where the ideas have sort of come from as we've gone through. Yeah. Okay. I suppose we can carry back on with how you'd make a basic query. Does that sound all right?
Yep.
Cool. Okay. So there's the specification pattern implemented here. You don't have to use this, but I find it's quite nice. I don't know if anyone's seen the one that wraps CF Core as well. It's a very similar sort of concept. So here we're newing up an instance of a specification, and here we're passing in how many results we'd like and whether they're ordered or not. So currently I've just got this as an embedded class down here. So here we just use link, and this just does link to SQL all under the hood, so we don't have to worry about any sort of raw SQL queries. So in this case, we can just say where the partition key equals the name of book category. So if we saw when we looked at the partition key value, we could see that that was just book category. And then the next thing is we've got paging built into here, which we'll come on to again in a little while. So we can say how many results we'd like, and then whether we'd like it ordered or not, it will optionally add an order by. And then once we've created an instance of that, all we do is pass it to the .query async method, and this will return, in this case, iQuery result. That iQuery result has got a list of items, and it also has the charge. So for anyone who doesn't know, every operation on Cosmos DB incurs a RU charge, and that's basically like the currency of Cosmos, and that's what you pay for in most cases. So in a lot of cases, especially for this example, using the serverless model, you only pay for what you use, which is quite nice. And then in this example again, once you got the items back, it's going to count how many books are in each category. So that's another method that we have. So in this case, it's counting all the books where the partition key is the category ID. So in this case, that's the category name. So if we was looking at the tech category, for example, it will count all the books in the tech category. And that's just, again, a nice helper method that's built on top of the SDK that you can use. And then it builds up a list of these and returns them back.
Nice. Hey, Billy, so I got a question for you, kind of going back to that specification pattern, because it reminds me of something, I think we used to call them query objects. Is it similar to query objects where I essentially define what my query is going to look like? Instead of writing SQL, because since we're talking about the SQL API, I'm not writing raw SQL. I'm going to have an object that's going to define my specification, I guess, for lack of better words. Like,
exactly.
This is the stuff that I want. I'm going to put it in an object, and I'm passing that on to the repository. Yeah,
exactly. And the nice thing about these is that you can reuse them. I mean, I've embedded them here just for the sake of the demo. It's easier to see, but you could easily have a folder full of specifications that you could reuse across your projects, which is a quite nice way to do it as well.
So then that specification support, is that something that you built yourself, or is that something that's a part of the Cosmos SDK?
That's something that the library built upon. It was an open source contribution we got not long back now. I think it was maybe a month ago, but it's been a really great addition. I've certainly really liked it. I can show one of the, so if you wanted to achieve the same thing here, what you could do is you could write something like this, and you get a get async method. And then on here, you can pass a function and you could write that query effectively yourself. Okay. But it's quite nice that it's sort of encapsulated down there in that specification class. It works really well. So it was really welcomed addition to the library.
Yeah, I really like that approach, because I find when you have those query objects, it makes it a little bit more testable. You know what I mean? You could mock your query a little bit, and you could kind of assert on, this is what I expect my query to do. So I definitely like how that's kind of built into the repository in a really easy way.
Yeah, that's a really nice way to do it as well, because I know there is some complications with if you want to sort of mock out a method that's got an expression. It can be quite difficult. I don't know if anyone's come across that before. Yeah. That's certainly something I've struggled with, but this makes it much easier. Can you say it is a specification, for example, if you're using mock, and then assert on the properties that you might assign. That's quite a nice way to do it. And then those sort of separates your testing concerns in that scenario.
Thinking back on my entity framework experience in my software development days, there was an iQueryable type that we would use to sort of describe the intent of the query. Is that similar to what we have here with the specification?
It's not quite the same, because obviously that can make requests as you perform certain queries. This tends to load into memory. That's why it's quite often, in most cases, when you're doing a query such as this, it's always best to include a page size. Because, for example, if you had, I don't know, let's say 15,000 categories, for example, you probably wouldn't want to pull all those straight into memory, which is what this would effectively do. So that's why it's quite nice in a lot of cases to use the page size. But yeah, it's very similar in that aspect. Shall we have a look at some of the creation ones? I mean, they are quite a lot simpler than this, so that might be a good place to go next.
Yeah, let's definitely take a look at those. And as you show that, I'm curious, so that specification pattern, does that kind of extend to some of those other query options? So can I do it in my, like you showed it in get, but can I do it in like some of the other methods that are a part of the SDK?
Yeah, so we've got quite a couple of methods that come for querying. So you can do something in Cosmos called the point read. That is where you pass the ID and the partition key, because that's what makes up a unique object in a container in Cosmos. So that would be a single read. So in that sense, it wouldn't be as such a query. There is an option to write direct SQL as well. So if you do get by query async, we could write some SQL here. You could say select star from C and do where C dot, and that is supported. It's quite a nice way to do it if you wanted to a bit more control over the query. I mean, I personally prefer the link syntax. The couple of other options we've got as well. The way the query async came about was the sort of first option you had for querying was always this get async, and you passed a predicate through, and then you could say partition key equals. We sort of expanded on that as we looked at paging. There was quite a lot of discussion that went on with that. So there's a couple of page methods on here as well. So you can use the traditional skip and take paging if you would like. That's can lead to quite high costs in Cosmos. Your IU charge can bump up quite a lot. If you was to say skip 50 records and you want page 10, for example, that's all supported as well. I haven't used that in this particular example. One of the better options for paging in Cosmos is the use of continuation tokens. So I think I've got an example onto that. Might be a little bit of a segue, but I'm sure we can have a look at this. So if we look at customer rentals, for example, and I was to pull up, I'd pre-populated Rob with a lot of rentals before this. So you can see we've got 5 results here. If I was to hit load more, that'll bring back the next 5 results. And if I was to hit it again, it'll say that there's no more results now. So I've exceeded all the results. In SQL or something like that, you would potentially do that with a skip and take or a limit and offset. That's probably something everybody's probably done before. In Cosmos, there's a thing called continuation tokens. So they're almost like a marker. So when I made that initial query, I would get back a token. It's in the form of JSON. I return that as a header to this web API. And then when you pass that back to Cosmos and our library, it'll basically say, this is where I left off last time. So can you go straight back to there, please? And that often results in a lot of a cheaper cost for your queries. So it might be worth showing that in the code. Anybody use continuation tokens before or heard of the concept?
Yeah, you were showing, like, while you go ahead and look for that sample, you were showing that option where you could write SQL inside of your code. And I don't know if it's just me, but I've always find like the database folks freak out when there's SQL in the code. Now, if there's a link in the code and expressions that do the same thing, they don't freak out as much because I don't know why. It does the same thing in my opinion. But for some reason, like they really freak out when we write SQL in code. So,
my experience has been the same. SQL injection is the very first term they throw around when they see the embedded SQL statements. Yeah, exactly. Like your security code review folks are definitely gonna have a field day when they're like, "Oh my God, they're writing SQL inside of code. Like we gotta, this will not pass, right?" And they slam down the gauntlet on you.
Yeah, it's quite difficult to test as well. I've found when you get a big block of SQL in your code, you almost have to write an integration test against the database, which isn't always ideal.
Yeah.
So I've managed to find the handler for this example that was pulling back those rentals. So for a given customer. So again, we've used a specification pattern here, but this time when we send the query in, we get this continuation property, and that's just a string. It's just a JSON object that tells Cosmos DB pretty much where it left off last time. So again, I've just passed this to my different specification down here. And this time there's some more methods on here. So again, we're specifying this page size, but here we can pass back the continuation token. And in this case, if that's not null, it knows exactly where it left off before. So it's quite an efficient way to page through the data. There's a lot more explanation on this as it can get quite complex on our docs site as well, which I can send a link to after this. But that's a really nice way to sort of page through data without using a skip and take. Let me jump back to one of the creation methods. So here we've got the create book handler. So there's a push request on this demo that allows you to create a book. It takes in a create book command, and then it deconstructs that into a set of properties. And then what it does is it creates the book, and it simply just calls create async. And all you pass in there is the book that you created. And in this case, that's the same book that we looked at the beginning that derives from the full item type. So on all of the methods on iRepository, there's a generic constraint that says it must derive from an iItem type. And that iItem type is implemented in this case by this base class, which is also provided by the library. But if you can see, there's quite a few other interfaces that this also implements. So sort of when you derive from full item, you get sort of all of the features of the library in straight away. Again, there's more on this on the doc site as well, because there's quite a lot of different options, which would probably be too much to cover today.
And that's a class that comes from the original Cosmo package, right?
No, that's something that we've provided. Sort of
You provide, okay.
Yeah, so that offers some sort of common properties. So there's quite a few different options that you can take for that. But again, the
Gotcha.
docs probably cover that in a bit more detail, as there's quite a bit to go over for that sort of stuff. It's worth showing here as well. There's another example of one of the methods we provide. So there's an exists async. So again, that's going to effectively make a point read on your behalf and check that the object returned was not null. That's quite a method that I found ourselves sort of often writing as an extension method on top of this originally. And I thought it'd be a good idea to add it into the library. So we came in and added it in for this as well. So in this case, it takes the checks if a book exists in the same category for that book. And that will, if it is, it'll throw an exception in this case, which will result in a 400 bad request. One of the other really cool features that I like about Cosmos DB is the change feed. So I don't know if anybody's heard of that before, but essentially what it is when you write a document or update a document, you can pull sort of like a list of the changes that have occurred in the container. And we built some support on top of the library again. The raw SDK provides a way to do this, but there's like sort of quite a lot of setup involved. And I think if anybody remembers at the beginning when we said we'd come back to the with change feed monitoring on the container, that's sort of where I was sort of aiming to head with this. So if we look at the rentals, for example, we've got a book rental here, which is again just another full item type. And we've called the with change feed monitoring on here. So it's quite a common scenario in Cosmos that you might want to partition the same data two different ways to allow for the most efficient queries. So in the sense of a book rental, when we make a query on the screen that we demoed earlier, that is querying for any books with a given ISBN. So if we go back to this screen here, you pop an ISBN in there, it'll bring back all of the rentals for that book. And if we look at the containers, we've got two. So we've got a customer rentals and a book rentals. So if I was to look at one of these book rentals, you can see that the partition key is always the ISBN in this case. So if we look at, again, we're using that partition key property, and that will pull that back. But in some cases, you might also want to query on the customer. So how many rentals does that customer have, for example? So you can use the change feed to replicate data from this container to this container. So whenever this record would change, you could process that change and then replicate that same data in here. And that allows you to query it twice, always using a single partition query. So the way you achieve that in the library is simply by calling with change feed monitoring on here. And there's a couple of other bits further down, which I'll just quickly cover now. So the way you process a change in a container is by implementing this interface, an iItem change feed processor. And what that looks like is if we look at this processor here, so this is called book rental to customer rental change feed processor. So this basically monitors any changes for a book, and it will create a corresponding customer rental here. And this is an update, but it's an upset. So if it doesn't exist, it'll also create it for you. So in this example here, we derive from the iItem change feed processor. And then if I was to change the book or update the book or make a new rental on that book, we would then get this object through in this piece of code here. And then in this case, we're just creating a customer rental, which is partitioned slightly differently to the book rental. All the properties are exactly the same. But if we was to have a look in the constructor here, it passes up through a base class the partition key, and in that case, it's the customer username. So you can always make a query either by the ISBN of the book and pull back all the rentals, or by the customer username and say how many rentals does this customer have. So in order to set that up, it's as simple as creating one of these classes, and these are often quite small. In most cases, they might, for example, raise an event off to another system that this record changed if you was doing event-driven architecture. Or in this case, it's just used for data replication to enable more efficient queries. But if we go back to the services collection extensions, so again, I think we might mention, if you do want to opt in for some of this, most of it's provided straight off the bat from the library. There is a hosted service that you can add as well, which sort of kicks off the change feed processes that run as a background process. And in order to get this extension method, you do just have to install one more package. That is this ASP.NET Core package here. And this is literally just a small little wrapper on top of this library again, the Cosmos repository that we've been looking at so far. And that just provides a nice background service that you can run in an ASP.NET Core app or a worker app if that's how you'd like to do it. So again, we've got a couple of extension methods here. So there's the add Cosmos repository item change feed processes extension method. And in this case, I'm just giving it the current assembly that I'm in. And what it'll do is it'll scan all the assemblies that you've provided in a list for the change feed processes. So in this case, it would pick up this one, and we've got another one here, which we can come on to in a little bit. And it'll register those as interdependency injection. And when you call the add change feed processor hosted service, that'll start a process in the background on a background thread, and that will pull effectively Cosmos DB and say, is there any changes for this container? And if it is, it'll pull them down and process them. And what's quite nice about this implementation is it first deserializes it and looks at the type, and then it will look to say, okay, if I am sharing, for example, a book and a book category in the same container, it will only call a change feed processor where the type is correct. So for example, if you wanted to only process changes for a book like we do here, if you get a change from a book category, it'll notice that you've got no change feed processors registered for that book category, and it'll just simply ignore it. So you don't call you wouldn't process those changes in effect, which is quite nice because in a lot of scenarios in Cosmos DB, items do share containers. That's quite common. Let me jump back and make sure I didn't miss anything off that services collection. And again, if you don't want to process changes, you don't have to. You purely opt in by calling this with change feed monitoring. And that can also be quite nice if you wanted to do that as a different app. So you want just a little small worker app to do this processing. That can work quite well. I know a lot of people tend to do this via Azure Functions as well, which can be also quite useful. So I suppose if we jump back to the book change feed processor, this one's slightly different. So this is a sort of a pattern that I've tended to come across and use quite a lot when I'm using Cosmos. So in this case, we chose to partition a book by its ID, and the partition key in this case was the category that it was in. But in some cases, for example, if you was to scan the barcode of a book, you wouldn't have the category that book was in straight away. That operation wouldn't be able to be run. So you got two options. You could either make a cross-partition query, which in most cases you should avoid in Cosmos DB, and that would effectively scan all the partitions of that container to try and find a book with that ID. The other option you can do is, I like to call them lookup entities. So whenever I create a book, I'll simply insert a lookup record. And in this case, all the lookup record does is, again, it's a full item. So it's just deriving from the same type that we've used all along. You'll pass in the ID of that book. And then what it'll do is it'll set the partition key to be the ID as well. So what that gives you is a nice, simple point read on a book. So if I pass the ISBN in, which is done in one of these examples, I can just find it. So if we look at one of the command handlers, the rent book handler, we actually delegate off to another repository here, but this is basically pulling up a rental manager. But if we jump into here, what this will first do is, all I've provided here to read this book is the ISBN. So what it'll first try and do is it'll make a point read on the book lookup repository. So this is a nice way to sort of show how you can compose the iRepositories together to build them up to provide sort of a richer feature set for your domain, if that makes sense. So in this case, we've got the book scan lookup. So what we can do here is we can say, given the ISBN, I'm going to get the book scan lookup. And what that lookup then allows me to do is jump to the master book repository, which contains all the other data about that book. And I can use the category that I assign on the lookup. One way you could do that. Sorry, was there a question there?
Yeah, someone is asking if this code is available on GitHub. I know they have the SDK on the GitHub, but do you have the demo as well there?
Yeah, and I deliberately put a lot into this demo to sort of show that everything that it can do, and then I suppose people can investigate that in their own time. It's probably be useful,
Yeah.
but I can share the link for that as well after this. It's going
Awesome.
to be public on GitHub. So I suppose just going back to this example. So what we use the change feed processor for here was, rather than when I create a book, also inserting one of these records, I'll simply insert the book, which was in this handler here. And if you notice, I just call a simple create async on the book repository. I don't do anything else. That's handled via a change. So when a book is inserted, this change feed processor runs, and that creates the book scan lookup record. And then when I come back to query this later, when I make a rental, for example, in this repository here, I can use that. So I'm looking in the lookup repository first, getting the ISBN of that book, and then that record there gives me access to the category. So again, I'm making another point read there. And that is just a really nice way I've found that allows you to avoid cross-partition queries just by using lookups, and the change feed works perfectly with that, because you don't have to worry about creating those two records in a transaction, for example. You can just create it and know that eventually you'll be consistent, which is quite nice. Just trying to think if we've got anything else that's worth showing off. How am I doing for time?
We got 15 minutes, 20,
Cool.
Less than 20 minutes. I had a question for you, or more so like a comment. Like, I love how the SDK or this repository package has like all these features that makes it feel like Cosmos DB in easy mode. Like, that's the way that I kind of look at it, right? Like, you have stuff for ASP.NET developers, you have stuff for folks that want to do testing and specifications, and like it just makes it easier to use. And then I think about when folks usually create those types of packages, there's usually some type of trade-off, because now you have to be somewhat opinionated about what the defaults are, if that makes sense. So I'm curious to hear, if I'm a new person, like if I'm new to Cosmos DB and I pick up this package and I just say, install package, insert a thing, what are some of the defaults that I just get out of the box if let's say I just came with the default configuration, like what does it do?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and that's one of the difficult things a lot of the time I've found when adding sort of features to this library. You've got to, where can I put an extensibility point in that? If somebody doesn't want the defaults, how do they override them? And in most cases, that always comes on the service collection extensions here. So you get a lot of options here that you can do all sorts of things with an item, for example, or what container that's stored in. Another thing is, we mentioned a full item at the beginning. So if you look at the book, that was a sort of a new addition that we've got. There is, and this kind of opts into a few things. So you can see the mention of the E tag, time to live, timestamps. So the library offers sort of off straight away, if you implement a full item, you get, let me think, what's the best one to start with? So time to live in this case, Cosmos has got a feature where you can say, I'm going to insert this record, but after 2 weeks, I'd like it to be cleaned up. So a lot of people will do an archiving job, for example, that might pull a SQL database and say if something's so old, let's delete it. Cosmos sort of offers that straight away. So in this case, you could use the item type. But if you didn't want any of that and you just wanted the basic item, I'd say it's probably best to start off with just the item type. And that then doesn't mean you've opted in for anything extra of what the library offers. And that just gives you sort of like the base. I just want to create a document and insert the JSON for it. And I just want to read that document. I don't want no extras, if that makes sense. So I implemented the full item in this demo just to show off some of the extra features that it does offer. But that's sort of like the starting point, I would say. There is a couple of other points that isn't included in this demo as well. So the way we tend to use this at work a lot of the time is we'll write some integration tests on top of our API, for example, that might use the MVC testing package. I don't know if anyone's come across that before, but you can spin the API up in memory and then you can make requests across to it. And sometimes when you're developing locally, it can be a bit of a chore to sort of get a test framework set up that actually is talking to a real Cosmos DB. And in some cases, you can run the emulator. In some cases, you might want to pay and actually use a real live instance. One thing we did add, it was one of my sort of first contributions to the library, was an in-memory version of this repository. So initially when we started off, it was sort of quite straightforward. It was a simple create, read, update. So all we did was just create an in-memory version of this repository pattern that just added those to a list and it just held it in memory. As the library's sort of evolved and gone on and it's using continuation tokens and stuff, the support for that has sort of become a little bit limited in some cases. That's sort of a really nice way if you've got some unit tests that you want to write, for example, you could just use the in-memory version. It's always best not to back that fully for your tests because it's never fully replicable, but it's quite a nice way. So I think we showed earlier the rental repository manager here. So you can see here, this uses a couple of the iRepositories to compose up an object effectively. And in this case, this is probably a good candidate for a unit test that sort of all this runs through. And what you can do in here is, for example, you could, instead of injecting the iRepositories via mocks, you could just inject the in-memory representations, because here we're just doing a simple read, another simple read, and then we're just doing a query here. So that's quite a nice option as well. I suppose one of the other challenges that we've found with open source is it's great to add all these features, and obviously there's a lot here, and you could go and talk about it for ages. But one of the big challenges we've had is sort of documentation and all of this stuff. So that's something we've been working on a lot recently as well. So again, if you jump to the GitHub repository for this, which we'll share afterwards, that's got links to a doc site that we've been working on recently that we're trying to sort of add the simple cases for these, like you said, how do I get started? And then how do you sort of dig into the more advanced features and override them as well? Which I'm sure that's a challenge everybody faces. You can add a ton of features, and if you know how to use them, it's great, but how do you share it with everybody else?
Yeah, and I'm sure that might be one of the areas that you'd love for the audience to kind of contribute to. So if folks that are watching, if you all think this is a useful library and you think this is something that you can make use of in your applications, sounds like a great opportunity to get started with open source and .NET, and probably dig through the code, head over to the repository. I think David Pine. We keep talking about David, and David's not even in the show. But David shared the link for the repo, so you can go in there and check it out and see like what are some of the things that you could probably help out with. I'm guessing y'all might have labels that say help needed or good first issue or some of those types of things.
I'm sure we could show some of those now. I mean, I've got the repository open, and again, it's on David's. Again, we'll talk about David. I mean, David's been absolutely great since I started working on this. He's pretty much just let me run with it. It's been a really, really great sort of project to get in with. It's my first sort of venture into open source. But yeah, we've got a few issues open at the moment. We've got quite a few ideas that are coming, and it's like every open source project. It's when there's time available, it's great to work on it, but it's not always something you can devote a lot of time to. So again, we've got quite a bit of stuff here. We've got some stuff tagged with documentation. We have some good first issue ones as well that are good, sort of like simple ones to have a go at if anybody did fancy having a contribution. I suppose my biggest bit of advice is have a look through the code, read the issues, and then just have a go. I won't be scared or afraid to raise a pull request. I mean, often it can seem quite a daunting experience, and you might get quite a lot of comments, but I always found pull requests are a great way to learn and sort of improve on how you write code and how you can get better. Pull requests are a great way to sort of share that knowledge and learn from other people as well, which is really nice. It might be worth showing off the doc site. It's very much still work in progress at the moment, but we've got quite a lot coming on here. So again, we've got the
Billy, I do have a question for you. Is there something in the GitHub repo itself that sort of says what the vision for the project is? I imagine you'll get issues asking for these immense features that would take months to develop, and maybe you decide, well, that's really not something we want to take on with this particular project.
Yeah, there's been a few things like that. So there was one request for multi-tenancy as well, which is obviously quite a big thing if you're using for a software as a service. You might want to have multiple customers and split across different containers. You might have different data requirements, and that sort of stuff's where it gets a lot more advanced. And in those cases, what I'd probably suggest is you can always sort of build a library again on top of this. So obviously this has wrapped the Cosmos SDK, and that's provided a set of features on top of that. But then there's nothing stopping you from taking that another level up, and let's say wrap this library and provide some more features on top of that. But as for a vision statement at the moment, it's not something we've got. I know it's something we'd like to add. but I'd say not at the moment. No, we haven't got anything in particular that we're aiming for. We've got a couple of ideas in the works. So I've been looking at using the change feed to provide an event sourcing model, because Cosmos DB is a great data store for that. It's unstructured. You get the changes on any events that you might want to store. So that's something that I think I've got a draft pull request open for at the moment. Still a work in progress, but I suppose that's coming.
I'm curious, as the Cosmos folks rev on their SDK, do you all have conversations with them, or are you paying attention to like some of the new features and changes they're making in their SDK to make sure that, one, it doesn't break you, but then two, it might also give you the opportunity to be like, oh, we can make this easier by like flipping this switch, right? Like, is that a thing that happens?
Yeah, we've had quite a few conversations with some of the Cosmos team, and some of the EF Core team as well have been great in supporting us. When we initially looked at the paging implementation, there was sort of a big debate on how should we do paging. Should we offer skip and take? Should we use continuation tokens only? And we sort of had a chat with the EF Core team and said, how did you do it? Have you got any advice, any tips? And in the end, we basically went for both options, but we said, let's document each option, pros and cons for each. Because in small apps, skip take's fine. But if you've got a lot of data, that could easily ramp up your costs. But in other cases, you might need that random access. So you might have to sort of incur those costs. So continuation tokens might not suit, for example. But yeah, they've been a great support in sort of helping and driving ideas. And then we're always keeping up to date with the current implementation of the SDK. I know they've got V4 in the works, so that'll be no doubt some work for us to make sure that we've provided everything that we did and we don't have any breaking changes under the hood.
Yeah, one of the things I know that the Azure folks, the Azure SDK folks did some time ago, they had this package called Azure Identity, and I knew it was one of those packages that was kind of being like it's being supported across a lot of the other SDKs. So like the Service Bus SDK and so on and so forth. Like contextualize or carry your identity across these different services in an easier way. And I don't know if the Cosmos one supports it, but I guess my question is, would that be something that you all would think about supporting like that Azure Identity construct inside of like, I don't know, some interface or something like that?
Yeah, I think we've actually got support for that already. I think I'm pretty
Nice.
sure somebody contributed that the other day. So I think when
you
connect,
might have to zoom this too, because this is like super small.
Oh yeah, sorry, my bad. Zoom right in on here.
Yeah, that's better.
Cool. I am pretty sure it is just down here. So there's, when you connect, you've got two options. You can either use the connection string, but a lot of people like to use the default Azure Credential, which I think is the one you're talking about. So when you add the Cosmos repository here, you can simply pass the account endpoint and that credential, and that'll flow through the SDK. So again, that's provided by the standard .NET SDK. We've just sort of added that extension point in as well. So you can do the same thing. But yeah, that's a really great way. I mean, I know we've had problems changing connection strings before and you have to go across a whole set of apps. That's quite a nice way to not have to do that. You sort of, Azure resource has identity and privilege to that resource, which is quite nice.
Is my audio quality any better now?
Sounds a little bit better.
Thank you. Kids' gaming headset, it gets thrown across the room a lot. I wanted to chime in about Azure Identity. So the default Azure credential that we just were looking at there, if you want managed identity support, default Azure credential will get that for you. Default Azure credential is just a fancy wrapper that attempts multiple credential types under the hood. Managed Identity Credential is one of those. You could also authenticate locally in VS Code or Visual Studio using default Azure Credential with no real need to change your code as you move through the environments. I like to describe it as an environment-aware credential wrapper. That being said, the other thing I would say there with Azure Identity, we are having conversations with the Cosmos team about supporting things like managed identity and Azure Identity. We'll see better support for this as they continue to develop their SDKs. Right now, if I recall, the Gremlin, Cassandra, and Mongo APIs do not support managed identities. The core SQL API does.
Yeah, no, it's a really great way to sort of, like you say, as you move through environments, you'd have to change a connection string as such. You sort of move through and that credential just sort of picks it up depending on what environment you're deployed in. like you said, even on your local machine, which is really useful in a lot of cases. It's something we've certainly spoke about where we need to move over to, just to ease that burden of managing connection strings. But yeah, like I say, you can pass that straight through on the library, and that goes straight through to the SDK. So that's quite a nice feature as well. Like I say, there's a ton of features in this, and depending on how much familiarity you've got with Cosmos, some of that might have been, oh, I'm not quite sure what that meant sort of thing, but there's a lot of docs on the Microsoft sites as well, which explain those concepts in a lot more detail. And we're working on the doc site as well to try and sort of bring that up to speed and say this is how the library takes its approach on that given feature of Cosmos. So yeah, contributions are welcome. Like I say, best to start with an issue, can discuss it from there. But we've got a lot of ideas, and yeah, like I say, we've been working quite hard on it recently.
Well, cool. We're running short on time. I wanted to, in the 4 minutes that are remaining, are there any last minutes remarks, things you wanted to share with the audience?
Nothing in particular. I mean, if there's any questions on the demo or anything like that, feel free to raise an issue on the GitHub link, which I'll share out soon. Be happy to answer any questions or clear up any bits that maybe weren't so clear. But
cool.
Other than that, no, I'll share all the links after this.
We fully expect those docs to be amazing since David is a member of the .NET content team.
Yeah, definitely.
So we expect nothing short of excellent. Cool. So for the last 60 minutes or so, you've been locked into the .NET Doc Show. As we mentioned, we are working on a transition over to the new format on the on.NET Live show. I'd just like to thank everyone for watching for the entirety of this show. How long have we been around? Since 2 years now?
Yeah, I was going to say 2 years, right?
Yeah, I want to say 2 years. So it seems fitting that we're evaluating the show and kind of, morphing it into something that I think will be much greater, kind of building upon the great work that Cecil has done with the on.NET Live show. So we look forward to seeing you over there. You'll see the very same faces, probably heavily influenced by the format of this show. And again, thank you, everyone.
Yeah, it's been brilliant. Thanks for having me.
All right.
Really enjoyed it.
See you, everyone.
See ya.
Bye.